The Bonneville County Prosecutor's Office has received the Eastern Idaho officer involved shooting report for the incident from June 29, 2015. I would like to commend and thank Lieutenant Ball and the Rexburg Police Department for what I view as a detailed and thorough investigation. I'd like to also thank those agencies assisting, that being the Idaho State Police, sheriff's offices from Bingham County, Bannock County, Madison, Jefferson, Power counties, as well as the Pocatello Police Department. I would also like to thank the cooperation of both the Bonneville County Sheriff's Office and the Idaho Falls Police Department. They must assist and make available all of the information they have, the people that they employ, in order for any investigation like this to be completed, and I appreciate their assistance. With that being said, what I'd like to do first is, just so you're aware of the process that we go through in my office, the policy we have. The case is presented to us. I then review that case independently on my own. The chief deputy also reviews that case independently, and then it's staffed amongst all of the attorneys. If there is a consensus among those three independent reviews, we're finished. And that was the case here, and so we came to that consensus after each of those bodies reviewed this, and that's what brings us here today. So what I'd like to do first is play the video that we've selected. Let me just take a minute as I've given you a copy of these things and we're playing this here. I would request that you exercise a certain amount of discretion. The video is very graphic, certainly not for all eyes, but that's not something I get to control. That's certainly up to you guys. In the early morning hours of June 29, 2015, Bonneville County Sheriff deputies were dispatched to a 911 call alleging domestic violence. Dispatch advised that the suspect was Ricky Mosley, that Mosley had left the scene in a blue Ford F-150. Bonneville County Sheriff's Office Deputy Austin Flagel observed the suspect vehicle pull into the Tiger Mart on the corner of Woodruff and Yellowstone Highway. Deputy Flagel indicated the suspect was non-compliant to his commands and requested assistance. Deputies Contreras and Riggs arrived a short time later, followed by Idaho Falls Police Department officers Dan Godfrey and Bart Whiting. Officer Whiting also had a citizen ride-along in his vehicle that evening. County deputies and police officers were driving their marked police vehicles and wearing their respective agency uniforms, identifying them as law enforcement. During this vehicle stop, Mr. Mosley was repeatedly told to show his hands to law enforcement. Mr. Mosley refused, saying no and shaking his head. A short time later, Mr. Mosley exited his vehicle with his hands behind his back, out of view of law enforcement, in an apparent attempt to conceal whatever was in his hands. Again, commands were given for Mr. Mosley to show his hands to law enforcement, which were refused again by saying no and I can't do that, as well as shaking his head in the negative. Mr. Mosley walked to the end of his truck closest to the officers and stated, quote, "My family is all I care about, and without them I ain't got SHIT. I'm paraphrasing that. After making this statement, Mr. Mosley returned toward the front of his truck, away from law enforcement, continuing to keep his hands behind his back and out of their view. Mr. Mosley was agitated, emotional, and non-responsive during this encounter, which lasted for several minutes. At this time, Deputy Contreras attempted to get into a position where he could deploy his taser to subdue Mr. Mosley. Mr. Mosley then lunged at law enforcement while drawing his hands from behind his back into a shooting position with his hands pointed out in front of him. A black object was in his hands. All deputies and officers fired at this time, and Mr. Mosley was struck multiple times in his groin and legs. 22 rounds were fired in total, 5 of which struck Mr. Mosley. Immediately thereafter, law enforcement requested paramedics and began life-saving measures. We stopped the video, the EMS arrives 5-10 minutes later. Mr. Mosley is currently at Eastern Idaho Regional Medical Center and in fair condition. Mr. Mosley did not have a weapon in his hand that night, but rather a black cellular telephone that he had in his hands behind his back and then brought forward to law enforcement during his lunge and shooting action. The phone that Mr. Mosley had in his hand is not in service and was a phone his child would use as a toy. All law enforcement and witnesses on scene were interviewed independently without the aid of their videos. Each officer's and deputy's statements were consistent and credible in light of the video evidence. Each deputy and officer indicated that they thought Mr. Mosley had a weapon, and that when he lunged forward with the object in his hand, that Mr. Mosley was attempting to shoot at the police. Mr. Mosley was also interviewed, and this sentence is a little bit, well, messy. Mr. Mosley was interviewed by the investigative team the following week after he had stabilized at the hospital, not on the scene. Mr. Mosley indicated that his keys were in his hand, that he tossed his keys to the police and they shot him. He also indicated that he was facing away from the police during the entire encounter. He indicated that he was not in the right frame of mind that night, that he was upset about his family situation, but would otherwise give no understanding as to his conduct on the night, other than to indicate it was his own stupidity that brought him to where he was. Mr. Mosley's account of his interaction with law enforcement on that night is in direct contradiction to all other evidence obtained in the investigation. Mr. Mosley has since been charged with felony domestic battery for his conduct earlier that night, and those charges are pending at this time. Those charges are based on injuries inflicted upon his domestic partner, necessitating her to be seen at the hospital. Mr. Mosley also reportedly smashed a vehicle window during this disturbance. Mr. Mosley has a lengthy criminal record, including felonies and other crimes of violence. A sample of his blood was taken that night, and that tested positive for alcohol. Let's take a minute and recite a little bit of the law on this topic. An officer has the right to use deadly force if he is reasonably in fear of death or great bodily harm to himself or others. The reasonableness of a particular use of force must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene rather than with the 20/20 vision of hindsight, where an officer's particular use of force is based on a perception as to whether a suspect may be armed or is actually in a threat to great bodily harm. The question becomes whether a reasonable officer would have or should have accurately perceived that fact. The officer must act quickly, must act as a reasonable and prudent person would, likely to act under similar conditions and circumstances. We can only surmise what was in Mr. Mosley's that night, or what emotional trauma had brought him to that point that led him to the actions that he took. We do know that Mr. Mosley had previously made statements that if he couldn't be with his family, he didn't want to live. And that if his alleged domestic violence victim called the police, that was the last time she would ever see him. Mr. Mosley refused repeated requests to show his hands to law enforcement, intentionally leaving them behind his back while holding this phone. This can have no purpose but to give the impression that Mr. Mosley had or may have had a weapon. When Deputy Contreras attempted to get into position to use his taser, Mr. Mosley lunged and drew his hands forward as if to replicate an aggressive shooting motion. Only then did law enforcement use deadly force. Just for your information, on the back of the synopsis that I gave you, I gave the still shot of what was presented to the officers on that night and what was presented to me in my binder. After review of all the evidence that has been presented, I find that law enforcement were justified in their use of deadly force. A reasonable, prudent officer in a similar situation would be expected to act similarly. This decision is based upon the threatening behavior by Mr. Mosley and subsequent actions that were done by him to appear as though he were drawing a weapon to shoot. This presented a very real, perceived threat of great bodily harm. Law enforcement's response to this perceived threat was reasonable and therefore justifiable. I'd like to take a minute to commend the officers for their response on that night. My review of the video indicates that they were controlled, professional, used multiple attempts to de-escalate this situation, and then after Mr. Mosley lunged at them and they shot him, they immediately began life-saving measures which No doubt, knowing what I know about Mr. Mosley's recovery, was touch and go there for a while from what I understand. And these officers no doubt saved his life. Their quick response to employ these measures after the suspect was shot saved his life, and for that